Charles, an 8-year-old boy, lived in a tenement in New Mexico, United States. He was an orphan and found shelter in the house of Mrs. Margaret, a kind lady, who always had a smile and a plate of food for him. The tenement was a modest place with worn walls and cramped corridors, but for Charles it was the only home he knew. Despite the regrets at that moment, the little boy felt at home, very different from years before he arrived at that place. Charles initially lived with his mother. His father, whom he had never met, slept with his mother only once and disappeared. Every day since he understood himself by people, Charles was left in a daycare while his mother worked, but one day no one else went to pick him up, and the little boy never knew what had happened to his mother that night. While waiting, he cried a lot, heartbroken, but the truth is that the little boy had been abandoned. From that day of abandonment, he was then sent to an orphanage. At the orphanage, Charles was mistreated by the head of the establishment, Mrs. Martinez. Sometimes he was locked in his room, deprived of food, and suffered physical assaults, even injuring his nose on one of the occasions. In the institution, even suffering from mistreatment, he made a best friend named Vicente, whom he called Sente, but he fell ill and after some time died. Suffering so much mistreatment from Mrs. Martinez, he considered the possibility of trying to escape from the orphanage, but he never did, and continued to be mistreated until one day he could not stand it and began to cry. Ms. Martinez asked why he was crying, and he told her he would like to get out of there. Ms. Martinez then told him, "Why didn't you tell me right away?" and unlocked the front door, letting the boy out. On the streets, Charles saw more than ever the sadness and loneliness up close, even the death of one of the friends he had made on the street. He even smoked cigarettes only once, and almost did not use drugs such as cobbler's glue, but when he saw one of his street companions faint and bleed from his nose due to glue, he fled without looking back, acquiring a trauma because of the blood. The street was not an easy place for a boy of only 8 years old. Living alone, Charles quickly learned to hide in the shadows, to look for places where he could go unnoticed. The winter of that year was especially cruel. He huddled in dark alleys, trying to keep warm with old newspapers and cardboard boxes. Days were spent in an incessant search for food, rummaging through garbage cans, and gratefully accepting any crumbs of compassion from strangers. After his first friendships that were terrible influences, he became a lonely figure, always a little removed, perhaps because of the pain he carried with him. At night, before he closed his eyes, he remembered the stories he had heard about families and homes, and wished with all his might that someday he would find a place where he could feel safe again. The day that would forever change Charles' life began like any other. The sky was covered with dark clouds, promising a thunderstorm. Charles, barefoot and in torn clothes, wandered the streets of the city. He had learned to read the signs of a storm and knew he needed to find shelter before the rain started. When the first drops began to fall, Charles quickened his pace. He knew the tenement only by sight. It was a large building of weathered brick with small windows and an old, neglected appearance. He had seen children playing there, their laughter echoing through the streets, and he had always imagined what it would be like to live within those walls with a roof over his head. When the rain turned into a downpour, Charles ran towards the tenement. When he arrived, he found the door ajar and walked in quickly, wet to the bone. The entrance to the building was dark and silent, but soon a familiar figure appeared. Mrs. Margaret. She was an old woman with kind eyes and a smile that seemed to understand all the sorrows of the world. Margaret saw Charles's pitiful state, and without asking questions led him to her small apartment. She wrapped him in a towel and offered him a hot bath and also a bowl of steaming soup. Charles ate slowly, savoring each spoonful as if it were the first decent meal he'd had in a long time. Margaret didn't ask about his past or how he got there. Instead, she offered him a place to sleep, a safe corner where he could rest without fear. That night, as the rain pounded on the windows and the wind howled outside, Charles nestled in a soft blanket and felt, perhaps for the first time in a long time, a sense of peace. He fell asleep with the feeling that despite all the adversity, he had found a new beginning. From that day on, Charles began to rebuild his life in the tenement. He made friends, found small jobs to help the residents, and gradually became an essential part of that small community. And while he never forgot the hard days on the streets, he knew he finally had a place he could call home. Donna Margaret was a central figure in the tenement, known by all for her kindness and willingness to help others despite the adversities that life had imposed on her. Margaret had been a strong, vibrant woman with a past that hid deep pain. She had married a good man, and together they had a son, Jacob, who was the light of her eyes. Jacob was a vibrant boy full of energy and curiosity, much like Charles in many ways. Margaret and her husband dedicated their lives to providing the best possible education and care for Jacob, dreaming of a bright future for him. However, life has its cruel ways of changing our plans. When Jacob was just 10 years old, he was diagnosed with a serious and debilitating illness. Margaret and her husband did everything they could to save him, spending all their savings on medical treatment and consultations with specialists. Despite all the efforts, Jacob could not resist, and his death left an insurmountable void in the hearts of the parents. The loss of Jacob deeply shook Margaret, who saw her world fall apart with the departure of her son. After Jacob's death, Margaret's husband, consumed by grief and guilt, became emotionally estranged. He passed away a few years later, leaving Margaret completely alone. Loneliness and sadness weighed on her, but she never let go of the compassion she felt for others. Over the years, Margaret began to suffer from a degenerative disease that slowly weakened her. Her mobility was reduced, and she often experienced joint pain that hindered her movements. Despite her physical condition, Margaret never stopped caring about others. Her house was a refuge for those who needed help, not only in the tenement, and she always found the strength to offer a smile or a word of comfort. When Charles showed up at her door on a rainy, wet, hungry day, Margaret saw in him an opportunity to fill some of the void Jacob had left in her life. She cared for Charles as if he were her own son, offering him not only a roof and food, but also love and guidance. Margaret knew she didn't have many years ahead of her, but she was determined to make a difference in Charles's life while she could. She taught him valuable lessons about resilience, compassion, and the importance of never losing hope regardless of circumstances. From the moment Charles walked through that door, the bond between Margaret and him grew strong and fast. Margaret found solace in Charles's presence, and he in turn found in her the maternal figure he had never had. She read to him every night stories of courage and adventure, and through these stories she tried to convey to him the strength he would need to face the world. Despite her own limitations, Margaret remained a constant and encouraging presence in Charles's life. She watched with pride as he played with the other children, made small beaks, and won the affection of the residents of the tenement. And in moments of introspection, she saw in Charles a part of Jacob, a reflection of the son she had lost, but who somehow lived on through Charles's actions and resilient spirit. During the day, Charles was seen running through the halls and the courtyard of the tenement, where he joined the other children to play baseball and football. He was a cheerful and energetic boy, always ready to participate in any game. Children loved his skills in catch-and-hide games, and Charles often excelled with his agility and intelligence acquired on the streets. In addition to the jokes, Charles made small mouthpieces for the residents of the tenement, especially for Ramon, a tough but kind-hearted man who lived there. He helped carry bags, sweep the aisles, and make small deliveries. In return, he would receive a few pieces of change or a piece of bread, which would help supplement Mrs. Margaret's generosity. The adults in the tenement liked Charles. They admired his disposition and his always positive attitude despite the difficulties. Even though it was a community of humble people, there was a sense of solidarity among the residents of the tenement. They helped each other, and Charles, with his helpful spirit, was a vital part of that support network. He learned a lot from adults, listening to their stories and receiving valuable advice. He often sat with Ramon, who told him stories about life and taught him small lessons in mechanics and repair. One afternoon, while helping Ramon fix a fence in the tenement's small community garden, Charles received a lesson he would never forget. Ramon was crouching, examining the rusty structure of the fence, when Charles approached with a handful of nails and a hammer. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the courtyard and dyeing the sky orange and red. "Ramon, why do you always work so hard? It seems that you never rest." Curious, Charles asked. "Work, my boy, is what keeps the mind focused and the heart at peace. There is a satisfaction in knowing that you are doing something useful, something that makes a difference. But what about when the going gets tough? How do you continue?" Ramon paused for a moment, hammer in hand, and looked directly at Charles, his eyes showing the depth of his experiences. "Charles, life is not easy, especially for us here. But it is precisely in difficult moments that we need to show our true strength. It is not about not falling, but about always getting up after each fall." Charles pondered Ramon's words as he watched him resume work on the fence. After a brief silence, Ramon continued, "You know, life is like this fence here. Over time it rusts, breaks, and needs constant repairs. But if you give up on fixing it, it falls apart and ceases to fulfill its purpose. The same goes for us. We have to keep repairing ourselves, learning, and growing no matter how hard it is." Charles frowned, thinking deeply about what Ramon had said. He felt that there was more wisdom in those words than he could comprehend at that moment. "How do we do that, Ramon? How do we keep fixing ourselves?" Ramon smiled again, this time with a gleam of pride in his eyes. "With determination, boy. With courage, and especially with hope. Always believe that better days will come even when everything seems bleak. And remember, you are not alone. Here we are, a family, even if not of blood. We take care of each other just like you take care of this fence now." Charles nodded, feeling a new understanding and respect for the man next to him. He picked up a nail and began hammering, determined to help Ramon finish the job. In the evening after a long day of play and work, Charles would return to Mrs. Margaret's small house. There he felt safe and welcomed. Margaret would read him old stories and offer him a glass of warm milk before bed. These moments were the most peaceful and happy for Charles, who dreamed of one day having a better life, but was content with the simplicity and affection he received. Life in the tenement was hard, but Charles never complained, for he had been through much worse. He had a resilient spirit and always found joy in the little things. Difficulties only made him stronger and more determined. And so he went about his routine, earning the admiration and affection of everyone around him, unaware that soon an unexpected event would change his life forever. Dona Margaret was the heart of the tenement. Her death was a devastating blow to everyone, but especially to Charles, who saw her as a mother figure. Lady Margaret had provided him with shelter, love, and the sense of belonging he so longed for. With his departure, Charles felt as if the ground was torn out from under his feet. The illness that had debilitated Margaret finally got the better of her. The last few days were quiet, with the residents of the tenement taking turns to take care of her, offering her company and comfort. Charles never left her side, holding her hand until her last breath. When she left, he felt an immense emptiness, a deep pain that seemed unbearable. Although Charles felt alone in the world again, he was not really alone. On the day of his burial, little Charles made mention of leaving the place. He gathered his few belongings that were in Margaret's house and that had now been put up for rent. He was already leaving when the residents of the tenement, including Mr. Ramon, seeing that sad scene, united to ensure that he was not left to his own devices. Ramon, with his outer hardness and kind heart, was one of the first to assure Charles that he would always have a place there. A few days after Margaret's funeral, Charles was sitting in the courtyard feeling lost and helpless. Ramon walked over and sat next to her, silent for a few moments before speaking. "Charles the First, know you're in a lot of pain right now. Losing someone like Mrs. Margaret, it's like losing a part of yourself. She was all I had, and now I'm alone again." "I'm crying," she replied. Ramon placed a firm hand on Charles' shoulder, his eyes reflecting the pain he also felt. "You'll never be alone while you're here, boy. Margaret left us, but you still have us. We will take care of you. I promise." Charles looked at Ramon, seeking some comfort in those words. Ramon's strong, confident presence offered a small ray of hope amid the darkness. With the death of Margaret, Charles began to sleep in different houses of the residents of the tenement. Each night he was welcomed by a different family who treated him with affection and tried to fill, albeit partially, the void left by Margaret. Mr. Ramon and other residents made sure he always had a warm bed and a meal. Despite this, Charles also felt the need for a space of his own, a place where he could take refuge when the world became too oppressive. He found this refuge in a large wooden box in the courtyard of the tenement, formerly used to store tools. Charles spent days cleaning the box and tidying it up to make it habitable. He laid out soft blankets that the villagers gave him and some of his precious few belongings. The box became his hiding place, a place where he could think, cry, and sometimes just hide from the world. Even with the pain of lost life in the tenement continued, Charles clung to the lessons he learned from Margaret. He continued to help the residents, making small beaks and strengthening his friendships with the other children of the place. The tenement community became his new family, a support network that sustained him in the most difficult moments. Mr. Ramon, with his practical wisdom and generous heart, became a mentor to Charles. He continued to teach the boy valuable lessons about life and resilience, preparing him to face the challenges ahead. Charles' life changed dramatically with the death of Dona Margaret, but he found strength in the community that surrounded him. Meanwhile, the place where he lived went on to rent, receiving visits from strangers day after day, and people, especially children, wondered about who would move there. Despite everything he had been through since moving into the tenement, Charles had always been a friendly and energetic boy with a smile that lit up even the darkest corners of the tenement. Most of the children in the tenement were his friends, and they formed a kind of children's gang that gathered every day to explore every corner of the building and the surrounding streets. Among his closest friends were Frederick, a skinny boy with an infectious laugh, and Sarah, a girl with curly hair and bright eyes who always had a new idea for a joke. Together they were inseparable. Summer afternoons were spent playing baseball on the vacant lot next to the tenement. Charles, with his agility and strength, was always the main pitcher. He had a steady arm and a focused look that intimidated the other players. Frederick, always ready for a laugh, was the catcher, while Sarah, quick as the wind, covered the bases. The ball was old and worn, but for them it was like playing in the professional league. Every win, every slide at the plate, every shout of run, it was a victory against the difficulties of their daily lives. When the sun went down and the sky was tinged with orange and purple, the children turned to calmer play. Hide and seek was a favorite. The tenement, with its labyrinthine corridors and dark corners, was the perfect setting. Charles, with his intelligence and cunning, always found the best hiding places. Once he managed to hide behind a pile of boxes in the basement, becoming so motionless that even Sarah, who was famous for her talent in finding anyone, walked right past him without noticing. On rainy days, when the streets turned into rivers of mud and dirty water, they gathered in Mrs. Margaret's small bedroom. There they would invent stories and stage impromptu plays using old sheets as cloaks and wooden spoons as swords. Charles was always the hero of stories, a brave knight or a fearless adventurer, and his friends were the faithful companions of his imaginary journeys. Charles' relationships with the other children were more than simple friendships. They were a chosen family united by difficult circumstances and the need for mutual support. When someone was hungry, they shared what little they had. When someone got hurt, they took care of each other with the skill of little doctors. And when someone was sad, they offered words of comfort and tight hugs. Once upon a time, Frederick fell out of a tree and hurt his arm. Charles was the first to rush to his aid, improvising a splint from a piece of wood and an old handkerchief. He took Frederick to Mrs. Margaret, who knew a little first aid, and together they tended the wound until the pain passed. Charles was also a natural mediator. When quarrels arose, as inevitably happened between children, he was the first to intervene, finding words to appease tempers and solutions to problems. His ability to understand the feelings of others and his willingness to help made him a natural leader, respected and loved by all. These friendships, forged in the playfulness and hardship of everyday life, were the bedrock of Charles's life. They gave him a sense of belonging and purpose, filling his days with laughter, adventure, and a sense of community that transcended the worn walls and dark corridors of the tenement. With the death of Mrs. Margaret, the friendship continued, but something still puzzled all the residents, especially the children who would move to the place where she lived. The sun shone brightly that day, casting its long shadows across the courtyard of the tenement. Charles and the other children were busy playing catch-up, their laughter echoing through the worn hallways. The courtyard was the heart of the tenement, a space where, despite the difficulties, children could simply be children. Charles paused for breath, leaning against the fence he and Ramon had recently repaired. Sarah and Frederick approached, also needing a break. "Did you hear?" Sarah asked, straightening her curly hair. "They say that someone is going to move into Mrs. Margaret's house." "Yes," answered Frederick, his eyes wide with curiosity. "But nobody knows who it is." Charles frowned thoughtfully. "I hope it's someone nice." Before they could speculate further, the familiar figure of the tenement's owner, Mr. Rodriguez, appeared in the courtyard, accompanied by a strange man. He was tall and thin, with an unkempt beard and eyes that seemed to assess everything around him with an intense gaze. The children stopped playing, their curiosity sharpened. Sarah whispered, "Is that him?" "Let's find out," Charles said, taking the lead. They moved discreetly, trying not to draw attention as they followed the two men. Mr. Rodriguez and the strange man walked slowly, talking in hushed tones. Children, keeping a safe distance, could hear fragments of the conversation. "A lot of work to be done, but you'll see it's worth it," Mr. Rodriguez said. The strange man nodded, his eyes wandering around the courtyard. "Yes, I can see it has potential." When they arrived at the house that had once belonged to Mrs. Margaret, Mr. Rodriguez opened the door and gestured for the man to enter. The children huddled around the corner, peering curiously. "Let's go in soon," whispered Frederick, his eyes shining with excitement. "Wait a minute," Charles replied, trying to hear more of the conversation coming from inside the house. The door was ajar, and they could see Mr. Rodriguez showing the rooms to the strange man. "So what do you think? Ready to move in?" The man smiled slightly. "Yes, I think we will close the deal." It didn't take long for the two men to walk out the front door, talking animatedly. "Come on," whispered Frederick, the most fearless of the group, as they cautiously approached. "Hello, Mr. Rodriguez," greeted Charles, trying to look as polite as possible. Mr. Rodriguez turned with a friendly smile. Hello, children. I see you're curious about the new resident." "Yes, we saw him coming." "Who is he?" Sarah asked, with a glint of curiosity in her eyes. Mr. Rodriguez looked at the man next to him, who remained silent. "This is Mr. Renato. He just moved into our community." Mr. Renato, tall and taciturn, watched the children with an indecipherable expression. Their dark eyes seemed to hide secrets that they could not unravel. "Hi, Mr. Renato. Where did you come from?" Frederick asked, trying to strike up a conversation. Replied Mr. Renato in a deep, deep voice. "From many places." The children exchanged glances, realizing that he was not very willing to talk. "What do you do with life?" Charles insisted, feeling a need to find out more about this mysterious man. "Things," Mr. Renato replied vaguely. Mr. Rodriguez intervened gently. "Well, kids, I think Mr. Renato needs to settle in. Let's leave him alone for now." The children nodded, but their eyes remained fixed on Mr. Renato as he and Mr. Rodriguez walked away. "He's weird," Frederick remarked when the adults were out of earshot. "Yeah, it doesn't sound very nice," Sarah agreed. Charles was silent for a moment, his thoughts immersed in the mystery surrounding Mr. Renato. Time passed, and naturally the children stopped caring about the new resident, concentrating on his pranks. But the tranquility of the tenement where Charles lived began to be disturbed by an intriguing mystery. Small and seemingly worthless objects were mysteriously disappearing. It all started with a casual comment from Mr. Ramon, Sarah's father, about an iron that had gone missing from his house. Charles, always attentive and curious, listened attentively to Mr. Ramon's account as they sat in the small garden in front of the tenement. "It's strange, Charles," said Mr. Ramon, scratching his head. "I was sure the iron was here last night, but this morning it just wasn't there anymore." Charles frowned, worried. "This is really strange, Mr. Ramon. Has anything like this happened to other residents?" Mr. Ramon pondered for a moment. "Well, I overheard Dona Caterina commenting the other day that she couldn't find a pair of scissors that always stayed in the kitchen drawer. And Dona Fatima mentioned that some small jewels disappeared from her jewelry box." Charles's eyes widened. "This is getting serious, Mr. Ramon. Do you have someone breaking into your home and stealing that stuff?" Mr. Ramon shook his head, worried. "I don't know, Charles. It seems that we are all being affected by this, but we have no idea who could be doing this." As they talked, Frederick approached with an air of concern. "Charles, Sarah told me about her father's iron. Do you think someone is stealing things from the tenement?" Charles nodded thoughtfully. "It seems so, Frederick. I heard Mr. Ramon, and he said that other objects were also missing." Sarah joined the group, an expression of determination on her face. "We need to find out who is doing this. My mother is worried about the missing jewelry. We can start by observing if someone strange appears in the tenement," suggested Federico. Charles nodded again. "Good idea. We'll keep an eye out and see if we notice anything out of the ordinary over the next few days." As the children discussed strategies for solving the mystery, Mr. Renato calmly walked through the garden carrying a small briefcase. His footsteps were silent and his gaze penetrating. The children barely noticed his presence, focused on their own worries. "Who could be doing this?" Sarah murmured, looking around suspiciously. "We'll find out, Sarah," Charles promised, determined. "We will keep an eye and investigate discreetly. We cannot let this continue to happen." And so the children teamed up on a mission to unravel the mystery of the missing objects in the tenement. With Mr. Renato always present a silent and enigmatic observer, the story was just beginning to reveal its deepest layers of suspense and intrigue. The tenement in those last weeks was shrouded in a tense silence as objects continued to disappear without a trace. The children, despite their tireless efforts to investigate, were frustrated by the lack of progress. Charles, Frederick, and Sarah argued among themselves, trying to understand how someone could be stealing without a trace. "It makes no sense," Sarah exclaimed in frustration. "How can things keep disappearing and we discover nothing?" Charles sighed, running his hand through his hair in a gesture of helplessness. "I know, Sarah. We are trying, but it seems that we are always one step behind." Frederick looked around, his eyes searching the courtyard of the tenement. "Maybe we need to think of another strategy. We have to be smarter." As they talked, Mr. Renato, always discreet and reserved, carried another Renato object wrapped in a thin cloth. He walked with calculated steps to the patio. At that moment, he noticed the approach of some voices were Dona Caterina and Mr. Ramon, talking, complaining about the disappearance of a new pot of Dona Caterina. Frightened, Mr. Renato tried to hide the object he was carrying quickly in the huge toolbox where Charles used to sleep at night. Without anyone seeing, Mr. Renato approached the toolbox and with quick and silent skill hid the object inside it. He looked around cautiously, his piercing gaze scanning the environment for any suspicious movement. "I said Dona Caterina," Mr. Ramon complained. "We've got to get a dog or something. He's going to get this thug. We have to protest. Mr. Rodriguez cannot allow that. I don't pay the rent anymore until he solves this problem." "I finally said," Mr. Ramon. Mr. Renato, satisfied that he had acted undetected, walked away from the courtyard with the same discretion with which he had arrived. He was determined to keep his secret, leaving no trace behind. Meanwhile, Charles, Frederick, and Sarah continued their investigations, unaware that Mr. Renato had just carried out yet another robbery under their noses. The mystery of the missing objects in the tenement remained as enigmatic as before, challenging the children to discover the truth behind the unexplained events. Mrs. Caterina and Mr. Ramon remained in the courtyard of the tenement, arguing excitedly about the disappearance of the scissors, the pots, and the iron. Outraged by all that, when the children, frustrated by the lack of progress in their investigations, approached to listen to the conversation. "It's absurd, Ramon. I swear I put my scissors in the kitchen drawer and the next day they just disappeared, complained Dona Katerina with her hands on her waist. Mr. Ramon nodded, visibly concerned. I know how you feel, Catherine. Sarah is also worried about the missing iron. And my brand new guitar, it's nonsense. Charles, Frederick, and Sarah exchanged significant glances. Frederick, always quick on ideas, suggested, what if we hide in the bin overnight? We can watch and try to find out who the thief is. The children agreed with the idea, determined to solve the mystery once and for all. While they were planning their strategy, Dona Fatima hurried out of her house, clearly distraught. What's going on here? Why is everyone so agitated? She asked, looking around with a worried expression. Katerina, not wanting to alarm everything, quickly replied, we are just discussing some things about the tenement, Dona Fatima. Nothing to worry about. Dona Fatima nodded, but her eyes searched the courtyard for answers. Meanwhile, Frederick noticed something glowing inside the crate that was nearby. Wait a moment, Frederick said, quickly approaching the crate and rummaging inside. I think I found something here. The children approached, curious. Frederick removed a cloth and revealed a watch delicately wrapped in it. A watch? Sarah murmured, surprised. Before they could process what they had found, the indignant voices of Dona Katerina and Senor Ramon echoed through the courtyard. But what is it? A watch hidden in the bin? Exclaimed Dona Katerina, pointing accusingly at Charles. This is nonsense. You fooled us, Charles. You are the little thief who is stealing the things from the tenement, accused Mr. Ramon with a mixture of shock and disappointment in his voice. Why did Charles do that? Fatima cried angrily. We gave you everything. We let you sleep in our homes, and that's how you reciprocate. Charles was stunned by the accusations, unable to articulate an immediate defense. The other children were extremely nervous as well, and the voices of indignant adults resounded through the courtyard, accusing him of being a thief, creating a climate of tension and misunderstanding. The children looked desperately at the clock in Frederick's hands, wanting to believe that it was not true, realizing that their attempts to solve the mystery had led to an even more complicated situation. Thief! Robert continued to shout, all indignant. In the middle of the night, after being unjustly accused and feeling deeply hurt, unable to defend himself, Charles made a difficult decision. He quietly left the tenement, carrying with him only a few things that he was able to quickly gather. His heart was heavy with the sadness and injustice of the accusations. He felt betrayed by the villagers he once considered his family. With no certain destination in mind, Charles walked through the empty streets of the city, tears mingling with the light rain that was beginning to fall. He did not expect that he would have to live on the street again after spending so much time with Dona Margareth. He took refuge under a marquee for a while, trying to process everything that had happened. I missed Federico, Sarah, and the other residents of the tenement, but the grief was too strong to face the return at that moment. The next morning, when the first rays of the sun began to illuminate the still wet streets, Charles's absence was noticed in the tenement. Frederick, Sarah, and the adults searched for him in every known corner, worried about his whereabouts. But Charles had completely disappeared, as if the tenement had lost not just a resident, but an important part of its own soul. As the day wore on, sadness set in among the residents. Some wondered if they had acted too quickly in accusing Charles without enough evidence. Dona Katerina, Senor Ramon, and even Dona Fatima felt the weight of guilt for having contributed to Charles' departure. Frederick especially felt guilty. He felt that Charles was not to blame, but his rash actions had contributed to the current situation. He and Sarah continued the search, asking the neighbors and exploring the most hidden corners of the tenement in the hope of finding their lost friend, but he was already too far away. Meanwhile, Charles wandered the streets, struggling to find a safe place to spend the night. His thoughts oscillated between anger and sadness, and he wondered if he could ever forgive those who had judged him so quickly. The next morning, under a gray sky and a cold wind that cut through the city, Charles found his way to the cemetery, for it was under the ground that lay the only person he truly trusted. He stood before the tombstone of Margaret, the kind lady who had welcomed him into the tenement and who now rested there forever. Memories of her kindness flooded his mind, and a lump tightened in his throat as he remembered how safe and dear he felt in her care. Margaret, muttered Charles, his voice choked. I miss you so much. Things have gotten so difficult since you left. He told her everything, every painful detail, from the wrongful accusations to his decision to leave the tenement. Tears rolled down his cheeks as he sat by the gravestone, feeling lonelier than ever. Amid the silence of the cemetery, an elderly priest approached Charles. His kind face and compassionate expression indicated that he had realized the boy's suffering. My son, can I offer you a word of comfort? The priest asked in a soft voice. Charles looked up, surprised by the presence of the priest. He hesitated for a moment, but finally nodded. Yes, please. The priest sat down next to Charles, offering him a friendly shoulder. Sometimes life puts us in difficult situations that seem insurmountable. But remember, you are not alone. God is always by your side, and there are people around you who care deeply about you. The priest's words brought some comfort to Charles's broken heart. He no longer felt so alone in that difficult moment. Did I do a lot of wrong things? Charles asked, his voice trembling. The priest smiled gently. We all make mistakes, my son. The important thing is to learn from them and move forward with courage and humility. My life is so hard. I never seem to have an easy day. You didn't do anything wrong, son. Come with me. Are you hungry? I'll give you something to eat. Charles took a deep breath, feeling a weight being lifted from his shoulders. He knew there was much to solve and many bridges to rebuild, but that moment in the cemetery next to the priest helped him find some peace amid the chaos. Thank you, Father, Charles said, feeling a new sense of hope rise within him. The priest nodded, placing his hand on Charles's shoulder affectionately. After the comforting meeting in the cemetery, the priest took Charles to his modest parsonage, not far from there. The heat of the stove warmed the room while the priest prepared a simple but cozy meal. Charles sat down at the table, feeling grateful for the generosity and care of the priest. As they shared breakfast, Charles vented about everything that had happened in the tenement. He told of the unfair accusations he faced, his decision to leave, and how he felt lost and hurt. The priest listened attentively, offering words of comfort and encouragement when needed. When Charles had finished telling his story, the priest gently laid his hand on his. Charles, the most important thing is that you know the truth about yourself. You have a clear conscience. You are not the thief they are saying. That's what really matters, the priest said serenely. Charles looked into the priest's kind eyes and nodded slowly. Yes, I know. I didn't steal anything. The priest smiled, encouraging him. Then, my son, you must return with your head held high. Don't let the words of others bring you down. Continue to be who you are with integrity and dignity. Charles felt a weight being lifted from his shoulders. He knew the road back to the tenement would not be easy, but now he felt a new determination. Thank you, Father, said Charles with sincere gratitude. You helped me a lot today. The priest nodded with an affectionate smile. I will always be here for you, Charles. And don't forget to pray. Sometimes it is in the tranquility of prayer that we find strength we didn't know we had. While Charles was away inside the tenement, the mystery of the missing objects persisted. More things kept disappearing despite initial suspicions falling on Charles. The community, initially united against what appeared to be an insider threat, began to realize that something wasn't right. Charles' absence coincided with new disappearances, raising questions about his previous charges. Federico, Sarah, and other residents in their own investigations began to find clues that suggested a connection between the disappearances and someone outside the tenement. Unknown shoe marks, abandoned objects in strange places, and even testimonies of neighbors about a mysterious figure prowling at night. Regret spread among the residents. They realized too late that they had wrongly accused Charles. They remembered the times he helped them, his gentle smile, and his way of caring for the weakest. The community deeply regretted the pain caused to the young man they considered part of their family. As the afternoon wore on and the sun began to set, Charles said goodbye to the priest with a warm hug. He felt refreshed and more confident than before. With a lighter heart, he headed back to the tenement, determined to face what was to come with a calm head and the certainty of his innocence. When Charles decided to return to the tenement, he was nervous and uncertain of what he would find. He slowly approached the entrance where Frederick, Sarah, and other children first spotted him. A cry of joy escaped Frederick as he ran towards Charles, followed by Sarah and the others, who soon surrounded him in a warm welcome. Charles, you're back, Frederick exclaimed, hugging him tightly. Charles, touched by the warm welcome of the children, smiled shyly. Yes, I came back. Soon the rest of the adults in the tenement also noticed his presence. Dona Caterina, Senor Ramon, Dona Fatima, and other residents approached, each with a mixed expression of joy and remorse. Dona Caterina was the first to step forward, holding Charles's hands affectionately. Charles, we need to talk, she began, her voice heavy with emotion. Before he could continue, Mr. Ramon intervened, his eyes waterlogged. We made a big mistake in accusing him. You have always been a cherished part of this tenement, and, Dona Fatima, with tears in her eyes, added, we should never have doubted you. The sincere words of adults deeply touched Charles. He looked around, seeing the worried and regretful faces he had known for so long. A mixture of gratitude and forgiveness filled his heart. I understand, Charles said softly. I know it was a difficult time for all of us. The important thing is that we are together again. The children around smiled, broadly relieved to have their friend back. Frederick, with his usual spontaneity, suggested, Let's all celebrate. Charles is back. The next morning, the tenement was enveloped in an atmosphere of relief mixed with worry. Charles' presence brought a sense of togetherness back, but uncertainty about the real thief still hung over everyone. The children gathered in a corner of the courtyard talked animatedly about everything that had happened. "Charles, where have you gone? What have you done all this time?" Frederick asked, curious. Charles looked at his friend's face, reflecting the seriousness of the past few days. He sighed before he began to tell about his encounter with the priest and how he helped him find peace and clarity amid the storm of unjust accusations. "I went to see the priest I knew when Dona Margareth was alive. He took me and fed me and listened to me," Charles explained, his voice charged with gratitude. "He told me that the most important thing was to have a clear conscience. And for me to pray." "Did you pray to find the thief?" Sarah asked. "No," replied Charles. "I wished him to repent and return everything he took." The children listened, attentively absorbing Charles's words. Frederick, with his usual wit, asked, "Do you think this can work? That the thief will regret and return everything?" Charles thought for a moment. "I don't know, Frederick, but I'd like to believe so. Sometimes people just need a gentle reminder of what's right." While they were talking, without realizing it, Mr. Renato was passing by. He had a nervous look and tried to go unnoticed, but Charles's words hit him hard. He stopped abruptly when he heard the children's conversation. "What are you saying?" Mr. Renato asked, his voice somewhat shaky. The children turned to face him. Federico, always direct, asked, "Are you worried, Mr. Renato? Do you think the thief will regret it?" Mr. Renato tried to keep his composure, but his eyes betrayed a mixture of nervousness and guilt. "Why would I worry about it? I have nothing to do with those things." The children, not fully noticing the tension in the air, continued to argue about what to do next. Meanwhile, Mr. Renato walked away quickly, his hurried footsteps echoing through the courtyard of the tenement. Mr. Renato, before he was known as the strange man who stole in the tenement, had a history full of sadness and regret. Born John Robertson, he was a family man, father of 2 children, and devoted husband. Life, however, reserved for him a series of trials that transformed him into the man that the residents of the tenement knew. But long before this, despite having risen and formed a family, John's childhood was marked by difficulties and challenges that shaped his character and especially his future actions. Born in a small village in the Texas countryside, John grew up in a poor family, struggling daily to survive. His father, a manual laborer, did his best to support the family, but work was scarce and money was never enough. His mother, a woman in frail health, devoted herself to caring for the children, but often fell ill, leaving the responsibility of caring for the house to John and his younger brothers. From a young age, John learned the art of survival on the streets. He was an intelligent and observant boy, but the need to help his family led him down dark paths. At the age of 8, he began stealing small items from local markets, fruit, pieces of bread, anything that could alleviate his family's hunger. At first, his thefts were small and almost innocent, driven by desperate need. He felt guilty, but despair outweighed morality. Each time he saw his mother's smile as she brought food home, the guilt was momentarily suppressed by a kind of pleasure. "John, where did you get this?" her mother asked, distrust and gratitude mixed in her voice. "I found it, Mom. I just want to help," he replied, trying to avoid her gaze. In others, he said that he had won his mother without the courage to confront her son in the face of difficulties, let all that pass, creating in John a feeling that it was the right thing to do. Over time, John became more skillful and daring. By the age of 12, he already had a reputation in the small Texan town, was known to merchants as a problem boy. The pressure mounted, and he felt like he was trapped in a cycle he couldn't escape. Once, while trying to steal a piece of meat from a butcher's shop, he was caught by the owner, a stout and ruthless man. He dragged John out of the store, threatening to call the police. "Why do you do that, kid?" shouted the butcher, holding John by the collar. "You know that's not right." With tears in his eyes, John replied, "I have no choice. My family is starving." The man, realizing the seriousness of the situation, released John and sighed deeply. "Go home, boy, and find a better way to help your family." Despite the butcher's words, life remained difficult. John tried to get temporary jobs, but his reputation preceded him and opportunities were rare. The cycle of petty theft continued until adolescence, when he finally got a stable job as an apprentice joiner in another city, where his fame did not make him miss opportunities. There he managed to maintain himself, living in his own shed where he worked until he had somewhere to live. Working with wood was what finally brought a sense of purpose and dignity that John had never felt before. He devoted himself to the craft, determined to leave behind the past of thefts. Over time, he became a skilled woodworker, gaining respect and trust. However, the shadows of his difficult childhood always remained lurking, ready to emerge in moments of despair. The tragedy that later rocked his life and led him back into the world of theft was a painful reminder of how the past can haunt and shape the future. Years later, as an established cabinetmaker, John lived in a small village in the northern United States with his wife Yolanda and their children Peter and Anna. He also worked as a carpenter and had a great reputation for his quality work, and although money was scarce, the family was happy. Everything changed when a devastating fire hit his home, also taking his wife and children. The pain of losing his family was unbearable, and he could not find solace. Desperate and aimless, John left the village and wandered through various cities trying to escape from his memories. With no family and no purpose, he again found himself involved in petty theft to survive. Shame and guilt weighed on him, but the need to continue living was stronger. On the streets, he also became involved with the use of drugs, and that made him steal even more. It was a sad existence, but he no longer saw any way out of the situation he had gotten into. And he maintained his addiction in this way, stealing and reselling objects from time to time. He got things of greater value and managed to live a while without having to steal, but most of the time he took small things that did not generate distrust about him. When he arrived at the tenement, John, now known as Mr. Renato, hoped to find a new beginning. However, the ghosts of the past continued to haunt him. He began to steal not out of greed, but as a reflection of his inner struggle. Every object he carried was an attempt to fill the void left by his family, a futile effort to find some control in his crumbling life. Charles's words, full of innocence and hope, hit him in a way he didn't expect, as if he had seen himself in that orphaned boy. They also reminded him of who he was before the tragedy. Before he became a thief, they turned over his past in a way that left him breathless, for in Charles he saw that there were other ways than what he had done since he was a child. That night, after listening to the children's conversation, Mr. Renato returned to his small house in the tenement with a heavy heart. He locked the door behind him and looked around, his eyes resting on the objects he had stolen. Each piece seemed to tell a story of guilt and regret. He sat in an old chair, holding his head in his hands, and let his thoughts wander. "How did I get to this point?" he muttered to himself, his voice echoing in the solitude of the house. "What happened to me?" Memories of the past began to invade his mind. He saw the smiling face of his wife, who always had a word of encouragement, and also of his children. He saw them running through the garden with their laughter filling the air with joy. The memory of the fire, however, interrupted these happy images. He recalled the terror and despair of seeing his house on fire, unable to save his family. The pain was so intense that it felt like a dagger driven into his chest. "If only I had been faster. If only I could," he whispered, tears streaming down his face. "I lost them. I lost everything." He looked at his trembling hands, the same hands that once built furniture to support his family, now used to steal. The weight of his past crushed him, and he wondered if he could ever forgive himself. Charles's words echoed in his mind. The purity and hope in the boy's voice had touched something deep within him. "Pray that the thief would repent and return everything," the words hammered in his head. "I don't deserve anyone's forgiveness," he said to himself, getting up and starting to gather up the stolen objects. "But maybe, just maybe, I can start doing the right things." He spent the whole night organizing the items. Every piece he put back in order felt like one less weight on his shoulders. With every object he touched, he remembered who he was and who he wanted to be again. Pain and regret mingled with a thread of hope. "Yolanda, Peter, and I hope you can see me now," he said aloud, as if speaking to the spirits of his family. "I was wrong, I was so wrong, but I'm going to try to be a better person. I will try to honor you in some way," I said in tears. With a heavy but determined heart, Mr. Renato wrote the note to Charles. The words flowed with sincerity, each sentence charged with his pain and hope. When he finished, he put the note and a sandwich in the bin where Charles slept. It was a small gesture, but full of meaning for him. That night, before leaving, Mr. Renato looked at the tenement one last time. "Goodbye," he whispered, knowing that the journey to his redemption was just beginning. With heavy steps, he walked away, taking with him the lessons learned and the hope that one day he would find peace. As Mr. Renato walked away from the tenement, he felt a mixture of sadness and relief. She knew she still had a long way to go, but Charles' kindness had planted a seed of hope in her heart. Perhaps one day he would find peace and the ability to forgive himself. The next day, the tenement woke up with an unusual atmosphere. The sun had barely risen when residents began to notice that something was different. The first to notice were Dona Caterina and Senor Ramon, who noticed the door of Mr. Renato's house open and empty. Curious, the residents approached Mr. Renato's house, and to their surprise found all the missing objects inside. The items were neatly arranged, as if they had been deliberately left to be found. Senor Ramon's iron, Dona Caterina's scissors and pots, and even Frederico's watch were there. Dona Fatima held Senor Ramon's iron, her eyes wide with disbelief. Was he the thief all along? Residents were relieved to find their belongings recovered, but a sense of bewilderment and melancholy also permeated the air. While the adults were discussing what to do, Frederick noticed something in the crate where Charles used to sleep. "Look here," exclaimed Frederick, drawing the attention of both children and adults. He pulled out a carefully folded note and a sandwich packed in paper. Charles picked up the note, his fingers trembling slightly as he opened it. Everyone around was silent, eagerly waiting to hear what was written. "Dear Charles, I know my departure may seem abrupt and inexplicable, but I want you to know that I never intended to cause harm. Life took me on difficult paths, and I ended up becoming someone I didn't want to be. Your words of kindness and hope, Charles, touched me deeply. You are a pure soul, and your prayers have made me see the truth. I leave all the objects I have taken in the hope that they can forgive my actions. This sandwich is a small gesture of gratitude for what you did for me without even knowing it. Your generosity and kindness gave me the strength to try to change. I hope one day you can forgive me. With regret, Renato." Tears streamed down Charles's face as he read the note aloud. The residents of the tenement listened in silence, many with teary eyes. Mr. Renato's message touched everyone, revealing the inner struggle of a man who, despite his wrong actions, found redemption through Charles' kindness. "He repented," Dona Caterina said softly. "Maybe somehow we managed to help him find a better way." Charles held the sandwich, feeling a mixture of emotions. He looked at the faces around him, seeing understanding and forgiveness reflected in them. "We all make mistakes," Charles said in a firm but soft voice. "The important thing is to learn from them and try to be better." The residents nodded, agreeing with Charles's unexpected wisdom. On that day, the tenement was united more than ever, not only by the recovery of lost objects, but also by the shared understanding that kindness and forgiveness have the power to transform lives. Thank you very much to those who have supported the channel financially through the link in the comment pinned. This helps me to bring more and more stories to you. And don't forget to like and also subscribe to continue receiving the new stories.